Thank you, Betty, and good morning. Yes, I'm going to talk about buzz monitoring or social media listening, which we know provides great insight into how people lead their lives, what they are saying, buying, doing, and most of all, saying. And brand owners embrace social listening because they want to understand what people are saying about them, what they're saying about their category. Who wouldn't want to know these things? So, we have this line, social listening is a great giant focus group, and I think that's appropriate because it signals one of the real strengths of buzz monitoring, its ability to deliver some fantastic qualitative insights into what people are doing and perhaps thinking. But I want to talk about a more quantitative application of buzz monitoring, and really to try and get people to think about the measurement of these kinds of conversations and chatter, but also then to link that better to business performance. And here I think we have some ways to go. So essentially we want to talk about the quantitative application, and here I think we've still got some ways to go before businesses have really fully understood the impact of all this conversation on them. At the moment, I think there's a lot of people questioning, particularly at senior management levels, does all this kind of chatter and noise online have any impact on our brand? Does it have any impact on sales, on brand health? Does it matter whether it's in Twitter or Facebook? There's a lot of unknowns, and that's really not helpful at all, particularly if we want this kind of application to have traction beyond the social listening teams, beyond the digital teams, beyond the insight teams. It's still very, very uncertain. And that's rather unfortunate because really there is, as you'll see, undoubted commercial application with social listening. It's more than just a qualitative tool. But at the moment, we've still got some work to do before we fully utilize that. The commercial contribution is not fully measured, if it's measured at all at the moment. We don't really know how these conversations link to sales and other commercial outcomes. Because of that, there's a lack of traction in the C-suite. They're skeptical of some of the metrics that are bandied around, and they don't see necessarily some of these measures as anything more than nice to haves. And it's compounded by often a very fragmented listening culture that's going on within our clients. And that's very unfortunate because actually there is very strong evidence that consumer conversation does drive ROI, it does drive hard business measures. From the Word of Mouth Marketing Association, they've linked buzz volumes to consumer sales, and there's a significant link across all kinds of product categories. Boston Consulting have shown the link between consumer advocacy and brand profitability. So there's no question, this stuff does matter. We're just not doing a good job at demonstrating it all the time. And I think, one thing we're passionate about and known for is that if we really do want to measure the social contribution to brand growth, then we need to think of social in a broad sense and beyond just Facebook, Twitter, blogs, the kinds of things that you can see and measure very readily in standard social listening tools. That's a great thing to do, but it's not enough. We've got to think about the conversation that takes place in other channels, the real world, face-to-face, on the phone, but also even in digital channels that are private, such as private messaging. Those things have a huge impact on brands. And so if we really want to measure the social contribution, we need to look at more than just what we can see and measure very easily through social listening tools. We've got to look at offline and so-called dark social conversation channels, because these are bigger, they're growing faster, and they're very different. So is that really true? Are they bigger? Well, here's some example here from Tesco. We measure Tesco conversation both online and offline through our tools. And if we look on the left at the online buzz volumes that Tesco gets, If we ignore kind of news comments, we can see about 21,000 posts a week for Tesco in online social media. How many impressions is that? How many people actually seeing these posts? It's a bit of a guess, but several million perhaps. But on the right, if we look at the offline or private conversation about Tesco, it's much bigger. Maybe 1 in 6 UK adults talk about this brand in a typical day, and the number of impressions in a week is 60, 70 million, easily more than what's going on in the offline world. And this channel is growing faster. How can that be? Surely people are living their lives more online nowadays. No. The channel that's growing faster is instant messaging, such as WhatsApp. Conversation is shifting back to private and more intimate circles, in fact. And what you see in those channels is very different. The triggers and motivations are very different. There's less what we call social signaling. Look at me, I'm smart, I'm cool, look at this great new thing I've just done. It's much more casual, it's much more intimate, it's much more spontaneous. People aren't trying to be a social brand in some ways, and obviously the participation is broader. Older people much more likely to converse face-to-face, for example. And different kind of factors drive conversations offline. We might have a want to talk about something in private. We don't want to talk about our bank problems, our financial problems to 200 people. We might just simply be a matter of what we're doing, who we're with at the time. The conversations just strike up for no apparent reason in the social we're with at the time. There are visual triggers. You know, it could be something you're wearing, something you're using. It could be a shop you're walking past. These trigger conversations, and they're very different kinds of conversations to one you'll have in Twitter. And obviously the role of media in triggering conversation means that offline media can strike a conversation up. So when we look at the performance of brands across different social channels, that's where we start to see some very different patterns emerging, depending on whether you're looking at what people are saying offline or in private, or whether what they're saying in Facebook and Twitter. Now, we do that measurement through a program we have called Total Social, which has a systematic ongoing measurement of brand conversation in all channels, 350 in the UK. So on this chart here is each dot represents a brand, and you can see that they're all over the place. Just because you're doing well in terms of conversation and visibility in Facebook doesn't mean that that's how you perform in the real world, and vice versa. The correlation's pretty low. So how do we do this? You know, the measures surely are very different, and indeed they are. You need to have some kind of common framework. Even though the way you measure offline conversation is very different to social listening, there's some very common kinds of metrics, some common principles. We want to know if we're being talked about a lot, so volume. We want people to say nice things, so sentiment's a very relevant concept. We want our stories to be shared and referenced. And we also want to be able to reach influencers of one kind or another. So we need a common framework, and we have that with Total Social. The offline piece you have to measure through some kind of survey or diary or apps. It's an opt-in kind of approach. You can't eavesdrop, but you can measure these things, and we think you should. And when you do, you start to see some of the patterns forming. Here's an example with Tesco. You can see on this chart we've tracked over the last year or so the volume of conversation that Tesco has online and offline. Now, I already mentioned that the scale of conversation is very different. You can't plot them on the same scale, but you can see the trends, at least, on a like-for-like basis. And here you start to see that they are different. In particular, if we look at the offline line, the green one, you can see that how the brand is discussed around Christmas time. It's less of a frenzy around the new Christmas campaign breaking. It's a much more sustained conversation relating to things in the stores, and so the peak of conversation lasts a lot longer. And some brands are what we call social misfits, like Argos here. They do pretty well in all the offline measures, but online it's not a particularly sexy brand. It's doing very well in digital channels, but the way in which people talk about it is still driven a lot by what's happening in the offline world. If you only looked online at Argos, you would say, oh, this is a brand that doesn't have strong social capital. But out there in the real world, it does pretty well. And you can learn and drive conversation by learning what drives performance in one channel or another. So if you are a social misfit, and maybe you are not doing well online, what can we do when we look at these so-called social sirens, people who perform very well in terms of online conversation? Well, if we look at them, you can see that they do very well in terms of the degree of their digital content. It tends to be a steady stream of shareable content, not just the occasional YouTube hit, but across the year, they are creating lots of bits of content that people want to talk about and want to share. And they have this is a kind of brand that has a bit of a social currency. You know, this is a brand that's quite a cool brand, perhaps, or at least within circles is one that's very relevant to people. But what about the other side of the coin? If you are maybe needing to drive stronger offline buzz, what can you look at from the strong performers there? Well, brands that are strong offline tend to be very relevant and visible on a day-to-day basis. In retail, for example, it's brands like Tesco that touch people's lives very readily and very casually, pretty much every day. They have messages that are perhaps easier to share offline. It's not reliant on sharing a URL or a link of some kind. It's what's being said in those messages and content that is standing out and shared. What about their use of media? They're using all channels to drive conversation, not just digital ones. And they maybe tap into offline advocates and influencers a little bit better. The school gate mum, the guy in the office who knows about cars, whoever it is, these people, these brands are relevant to them. And we do need to think about activation. It's not just about measurement, it's the impact of that, of social on the brands. We want to be trying to drive strong online conversation for these brands. And if we're only interested in driving conversation online, that's a very narrow and unambitious target. We should be trying to activate all social channels, get people talking about us online and offline, public and private. And if we can do that, then we have a stronger chance of adopting those social forces to drive performance. The WMR ROI analysis that I talked about earlier, when they looked at the impact of different channels on brands, they saw that offline word of mouth and conversation had the strongest impact, about 2/3 of the sales impact, and online 1/3. So you can see that all channels are important, but maybe offline is the one that's bigger. And then when we start to understand measurement and activation, we start to understand too the levers that we can pull to try and drive up conversation and start to have a broader perspective. It's not just about what we do in digital that's important. All kinds of things that we do are able to drive conversation and influence them. And we don't have to be restricted purely to digital activity to drive digital outcomes. In fact, I think what we do need is a much better and broader perspective on the role of digital in driving conversation. At the moment, it's too siloed. People are just thinking about digital activity to drive digital buzz, when the realities are much more blurred and intertwined. So on the left, you can think about the extent to which digital content drives offline as well as online conversation. A huge amount of the impact of digital content and media is in driving offline buzz. And that means we need to think about driving that kind of activity to achieve that. And similarly, the outcome of offline word of mouth is often digital journeys, so to search, to web visits. And clearly, therefore, if we're trying to understand the customer journey through social, we need to make sure we think about the role of offline as part of that. So in summary, it's time to have a grown-up and a more joined-up view in the way in which we think about social, the way in which we measure it, and the way in which we try and activate it. The impact of social forces is very significant on brands, but we need to think what social is in the broadest sense. We need to measure and activate all of it, and not just what's easy and convenient to see in online social listening. Thanks very much for listening.